The driver had 90 seconds left and he didn't know it. He was singing along to something on the radio, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping a cigarette pack against the dashboard. The fuel gauge of his Kamaz tanker read 3/4 full, 26,000 liters of diesel sloshing in the steel belly behind him. 70 kilometers of empty steppe road between him and the front. He had driven this route 9 times. The 10th time, something the size of a microwave oven came out of the morning haze at 60 meters of altitude and locked onto the cab. This is what Army Inform reported on May 19, 2026, citing combat footage released by a Ukrainian long-range FPV unit operating under the General Staff's Deep Strike Directorate. The strike happened the previous morning, just after first light, on a service road connecting a Russian forward fuel depot in temporarily occupied southern Zaporizhia to a forward refueling point feeding 2 motor rifle battalions. The tanker was a single Kamaz 6520 Bowser militarized variant with a unit cost on the Russian wholesale market of around $85,000 before the fuel inside it was counted. The fuel inside it, at current Russian wartime diesel prices, added another $22,000. Cargo and platform together, $107,000. Rolling at 60 kilometers an hour through a stretch of grassland, the Russian Logistics Command had labeled, in writing, a green corridor. A green corridor in Russian logistics doctrine means a road where, based on the current threat assessment, you do not need an escort, you do not need overhead cover, and you do not need to keep radio discipline. You drive, you smoke, you sing along to the radio. The threat assessment was 9 months old. It predated the new generation of Ukrainian long-range FPV platforms by exactly that long. The unit that flew the strike has not been named publicly. Ukrainian operational security around deep strike FPV teams has tightened sharply since late 2025, when Russian counter-battery teams began hunting launch sites with Lancet swarms. What Army Inform did confirm is the platform class, a fixed-wing internal combustion FPV with a roughly 1.5 kilogram shaped charge warhead, launched from a Ukrainian-held position somewhere west of the Dnipro. Range to target, between 68 and 72 kilometers depending on which side of the road you measure from. Flight time, approximately 52 minutes from launch to terminal dive. Operator on the stick at the moment of impact. A single pilot working through a Starlink relayed video feed routed via 2 airborne signal repeaters, also Ukrainian, loitering at higher altitude. That last detail matters. We will come back to the repeaters. They are the reason this strike worked at all. The Russian fuel column had departed its rear depot at 0540 Moscow time. 2 trucks originally. The lead vehicle was a soft-skin Ural carrying 2 crew, the radio, and 3 jerry cans of spare diesel. The trail vehicle was the Kamaz Bowser. They separated at a junction roughly 12 kilometers earlier, the Ural turning north toward a battalion command post, the tanker continuing east-southeast toward the refueling point. The Ural's driver later, on an intercepted channel, said the tanker driver had waved out the window as they split. He was in a good mood. He had been promised 48 hours of leave after this run. He never got the 48 hours. The geography around the strike point is worth understanding, because it is the entire reason a fixed-wing FPV could reach this road at all. The terrain south of the line, in the band between the front and the depot, is open agricultural steppe. Winter wheat stubble, low rolling hills, a few shelter belts of acacia and pine. Russian air defense in this zone is anchored on 2 Pantsir-S1 batteries, 1 Tor M2, and a screen of man-portable Verba launchers distributed among logistics security platoons. On paper, that is a dense overlapping bubble. In practice, the Pantsir radars have a known dead zone at low altitude over the shelter belts, and the Tor is positioned to defend the depot itself, not the road. A target moving at 120 kilometers an hour, at 30 to 60 meters of altitude, threading the shelter belts, is effectively invisible to the air defense net for most of the corridor. The Ukrainian operator knew this. He had flown the route 3 times in the previous 14 days, on reconnaissance runs, using a different airframe carrying a camera instead of a warhead. 2 of those flights returned to base. 1 was lost to fuel exhaustion at the 74-kilometer mark, deliberately ditched into a field after the camera had finished its job. The footage from those 3 flights, frame by frame, terrain feature by terrain feature, built the flight plan that put the live warhead onto the cab of the Kamaz. This is what deep strike FPV warfare actually looks like in 2026. It is not a kid with goggles and a quadcopter chasing a tank from a tree line 200 meters away. It is a multi-week reconnaissance and targeting cycle, with named flight corridors, named handoff points, named blind spots in the enemy radar net, and a single human pilot at the end of the chain pressing a trigger when the silhouette in the screen matches the silhouette in the briefing folder. 9 days before the strike, the Ukrainian targeting cell received a packet from HUR, Ukrainian military intelligence, flagging an increase in Russian diesel deliveries along the southern Zaporizhzhia axis. The signature was unmistakable, a measurable uptick in the number of fuel-laden runs leaving a known depot near a settlement we will not name here, paired with a corresponding rise in Russian armor activity at a refueling point 20 kilometers behind the line of contact. Somebody was preparing something. The targeting cell did not need to know what. They needed to know which truck on which day on which road. The reconnaissance flights began on May 9. The first run flew the southern leg of the corridor and confirmed two things. First, the shelter belt dead zone in the Pantsir coverage was still open. No new radars had been moved in. Second, the road itself was clearly being used as a primary logistics artery, with churn marks in the verge soil at every culvert and at least 6 fresh oil stains along a single 2-kilometer stretch. The road was alive. The second reconnaissance flight on May 12 ran the corridor at a different time of day, late afternoon, and caught a column of 3 Kamaz tankers moving together. That detail told the targeting cell two things at once. The Russians were running fuel in groups when they felt nervous about a route, and singly when they felt safe. The road shifted between those states depending on what the Russian electronic warfare picture looked like that day. To strike a single tanker, the Ukrainian operator would need to fly on a day when the Russian EW picture said safe. The third flight, on May 16, returned home with a complete terrain map and a confirmed clean corridor. The shooter aircraft was prepped that night. Inside the depot, the Russian commander responsible for the Green Corridor designation was a lieutenant colonel of the Rear Services Branch, a 41-year-old logistics officer who had spent most of the war in offices well behind the front. His name appears in 2 leaked Russian Ministry of Defense personnel rosters from 2024 and again in an intercepted radio log from late 2025. He believed, based on his own threat assessment, that no Ukrainian FPV had ever flown deeper than 55 kilometers along this axis. That assessment was correct as of August 2025. By May 2026, it was 9 months out of date and roughly 20 kilometers wrong. This is the gap that gets people killed in modern war. Not bravery, not cowardice, not training. The lag between when a new capability appears on the battlefield and when the enemy's standing orders are rewritten to account for it. The Ukrainian deep strike FPV crossed the 55-kilometer line in October 2025. The Russian logistics directive that called the road south of the depot a green corridor was last updated in February 2026. 3 months too late. Nobody in the directorate had thought to revise it. The lieutenant colonel did not order the revision because he had not been told it was needed. The men who knew it was needed were dead, captured, or fighting elsewhere, so the tankers kept rolling, singly on quiet days, in small groups on noisy ones. May 18 was a quiet day. At 0540 Moscow time, the Kamaz left the depot. At 0552, the Ural and the tanker split at the junction. At 0554, in a small concrete bunker more than 70 kilometers to the northwest on the Ukrainian side of the line, an operator with a withheld call sign flicked a master arm switch and watched the airframe roll down a short, improvised ramp into the dawn sky. The first 10 minutes of the flight were routine. The FPV climbed to a cruise altitude of 120 meters, leveled off, and began its outbound run on a heading that would put it well south of the most heavily defended corridor. A deliberate dogleg designed to keep the Pantsir batteries to the north of the airframe at all times. 2 airborne repeaters, both Ukrainian, both unarmed, were already on station at 300 meters of altitude, one near the line of contact, one 20 kilometers further east. They were there for one purpose: to carry the video signal back to the operator without dropping a frame. The repeaters are the reason this strike worked. Without them, an FPV more than 30 kilometers from its operator loses its video feed to terrain masking and atmospheric attenuation. With them a small, expensive, and politically sensitive piece of Ukrainian deep strike kit, the operator's screen stays clear out to 100 kilometers and beyond. The repeaters were how the operator saw the tanker. The repeaters were how the operator put the warhead exactly where he put it. We said we'd come back to them. There they are. 22 minutes into the flight, the airframe crossed the line of contact at 50 meters of altitude. Threading between two shelter belts, the operator had memorized from the reconnaissance footage. No air defense radar painted it. No small arms fire reached it. The morning was cold and still, and the engine note was lost in the wind across the wheat stubble. The pilot's heart rate, according to a later interview given to a Ukrainian military magazine, was steady. He had done this kind of approach before. He had not done it on a target this valuable. 38 minutes into the flight, the operator put the airframe into a wide loiter pattern over a road junction roughly 4 kilometers ahead of where the tanker was expected to pass. The plan was simple. Spot the silhouette, confirm the silhouette, dive, impact. The plan did not allow for hesitation. A tanker moving at 60 kilometers per hour covers a kilometer per minute. The window for clean identification was small. At 41 minutes, the silhouette entered the upper left corner of the screen. The operator zoomed the camera. The silhouette resolved. Kamaz 6520, militarized variant, single cab, cylindrical tank body, no escort, no overhead. The fuel placards on the side of the tank were visible at the moment of zoom. The driver, alone in the cab, was visible behind the windshield, head bobbing slightly in time with whatever was on the radio. The operator pushed the stick forward. What followed lasted 17 seconds. At 41 minutes and 4 seconds into the flight, the airframe rolled into a 30-degree dive from 120 meters of altitude. The camera, gimbal stabilized, held the cab of the Kamaz centered in the reticle. The road below filled the frame from edge to edge. The shelter belt to the right of the road raced past in a green-brown blur. The operator's left hand stayed on the throttle. His right hand stayed on the stick. He did not blink, he later said, for the entire descent. At 41 minutes and 10 seconds, the airframe was at 60 meters of altitude, 200 meters behind the tanker, closing at a relative velocity of around 40 meters per second. The driver had not seen it. The driver had no mirror that pointed at the sky. The driver was still tapping the cigarette pack against the dashboard. At 41 minutes and 14 seconds, the airframe was at 20 meters of altitude, 50 meters behind the cab. The camera now showed the rear of the tank, the hazard placards in sharp detail, the rivets along the seam of the cylindrical body, the small red splash of the manufacturer's stencil. The shape-charged warhead in the nose of the airframe was, at that range, 3/4 of a second from impact. At 41 minutes and 15 seconds, the operator nudged the stick a finger's width to the right and walked the reticle off the tank and onto the cab. He did this deliberately. He had been trained to do it. A shape-charged warhead detonating into the rear of a diesel Bowser will rupture the tank and ignite a pool fire, but it will not end the truck as a system. A shape-charged warhead detonating into the cab, into the engine block, the electronics, the driver, will end the vehicle as a functioning system in a single instant. He aimed for the cab. At 41 minutes and 17 seconds, the screen went white. The operator's video feed cut for 2 full seconds while the warhead detonated. When the feed came back, via a second airborne repeater that had drifted into position to maintain coverage, the screen showed a column of black smoke rising vertically out of a crater in the road where the cab had been. The cylindrical tank body, ruptured along its forward third, was still rolling on fire into the shelter belt to the right. Diesel was pooling on the asphalt and burning. The shelter belt was beginning to catch. 6 kilometers away, a Russian dispatcher with a logistics call sign, "We will use dispatch for the purposes of this video," keyed his microphone and called the tanker driver. He used the driver's personal call sign. No answer. He called again, no answer. He switched to the depot's secondary net and asked whether anyone had eyes on the road. 3 different voices came back. One was a Russian observation post on a hill 4 kilometers north of the strike point. The observer said. In a tone the intercepted recording captures clearly that he could see smoke. A lot of smoke, a column of it. Climbing, he could not see the truck. Dispatch asked him to estimate the height of the column. The observer said 600 meters, maybe more, black, very black. Dispatch was silent for 11 seconds. Then he keyed the microphone again and told the observer to send a fire team down the road to confirm. The fire team was a 4-man squad with a UAZ. It took them 19 minutes to reach the strike point. By the time they arrived, the cab of the Kamaz was no longer recognizable as a cab. The tank body was a blackened cylinder lying half in the shelter belt, half on the asphalt, still venting smoke. The driver was inside what was left of the cab. The diesel pool fire had burned out most of the surrounding vegetation in a rough oval 30 meters across. The fire team called dispatch and reported total loss. Dispatch passed the report up the chain. Inside the depot, the lieutenant colonel of rear services received the report at 0648 Moscow time. The intercepted log captures him asking twice whether the strike had been an artillery round or a drone. The fire team confirmed drone. Small, fixed wing came in from the west. They had found pieces of a composite airframe in the shelter belt, a stabilizer part of a wing root, a fragment of what looked like a camera mount. The lieutenant colonel's next order, captured in the same intercept, was to halt all single-vehicle fuel runs along that corridor for the next 24 hours. The corridor was no longer green. The corridor was now. In the language of the directive he dictated to a clerk 7 minutes after the report came in, a contested logistics axis with confirmed deep strike threat. That phrase, confirmed deep strike threat, is the bureaucratic fingerprint of every Russian rear area along this front in 2026. It used to appear only in zones within 30 kilometers of the line of contact. Then 40, then 50, then 60. By May 18, it had reached 70. The Russian rear is no longer the rear. The Russian rear is the front with extra paperwork. The financial accounting on the strike came in over the following 36 hours. The tanker itself, $85,000. The fuel, $22,000. The road, requiring a culvert repair where the warhead had cratered the verge, an estimated $4,000 at Russian rear area construction rates. The shelter belt fire, which spread for an additional 600 meters before the Russian fire team contained it, cost another small fortune in unrecorded ecological damage. None of these numbers on their own justify a deep strike mission. The mission was not justified by the price of the truck. The mission was justified by what the truck was feeding. The refueling point 20 kilometers behind the line, the one the tanker had been driving toward, was preparing to top off the diesel reserves of a Russian motor rifle battalion preparing for a small-scale counterattack near a contested village we will not name in this video for operational reasons. That counterattack was scheduled, according to a separate HUR intercept, for the night of May 19 to May 20. The battalion's combat readiness state depended, among many other things, on having a full diesel reserve at the refueling point by 0800 on May 18. The tanker that burned on the road was the second-to-last delivery in that resupply cycle. The counterattack, according to Ukrainian frontline reports filed late on May 18 and again on May 19, did not happen. Russian armor in the staging area was observed by Ukrainian reconnaissance drones to remain stationary for the entire window. The diesel never reached them, not all of it anyway. A second tanker, dispatched later that morning under the lieutenant colonel's revised directive, with an escort, a different route, and a delayed departure, made it through. But it carried 26,000 liters. The reserve at the refueling point needed 52,000. Half a load is not a counterattack. Half a load is a column of cold tanks idling in a wood line, waiting for fuel that is not coming. Remember the airborne repeaters we talked about at the start of the mission? The two unarmed Ukrainian aircraft loitering at 300 meters of altitude that carried the video feed across the distance. They stayed on station for 48 more minutes after the strike. They watched the Russian fire team arrive. They watched the column of smoke climb and lean and finally collapse. They watched a second Russian vehicle, this one a soft-skinned truck, arrive with a tarp to drape over what remained of the tanker driver. Then they turned for home. One of them made it back. The other was lost over the line of contact to a burst of small arms fire from a Russian infantry position the targeting cell had not flagged. Nobody on the Ukrainian side called that a bad trade. OSINT analysts on Telegram and on the open intelligence platforms picked up the strike footage within 9 hours. By the morning of May 19, the video had been geolocated to a stretch of road south of the named depot. The airframe class had been identified by a French analyst working from the wing root fragment visible in a Russian Telegram channel's own coverage. And the financial loss figure had been calculated by two independent open-source teams within $20,000 of each other. The Independent ran a short item on the strike the same day, framed inside a wider piece on how novel Ukrainian FPV tactics were forcing Russian commanders to rewrite their rear area doctrine on a rolling basis. That word, rolling, is the right one. Russian rear area doctrine in 2026 is no longer a document that is updated annually or quarterly. It is a document that is updated in practice every time a tanker burns on a road that used to be safe. The Lieutenant Colonel of Rear Services in southern Zaporizhia received, on the evening of May 18, 3 separate directives from 3 separate higher headquarters telling him to revise his threat assessment. He revised it. By the morning of May 19, the corridor south of his depot was redrawn on the Russian operational map as an orange, contested corridor with mandatory escort, mandatory overhead cover where available, and mandatory radio discipline. The Russians do not have enough escorts. The Russians do not have enough overhead cover. The Russians increasingly do not have enough trucks. Every liter of diesel that does not reach the front is a tank that does not move. Every tank that does not move is an infantry assault that goes in without armor support. Every infantry assault that goes in without armor support produces a casualty list the Russian Ministry of Defense will not publish, but the Ukrainian General Staff will count. The Ukrainian General Staff's daily loss tally for May 18, released on the morning of the 19th, listed 1 fuel truck destroyed in the southern direction. 1 line on a list of 43 lines. The other 42 were tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery pieces, drones, small arms. The fuel truck was the cheapest line on the list. It may also have been the most consequential. The driver of the Kamaz had spent the past 2 years driving fuel trucks for the Russian army on contract. One of tens of thousands of contractniki who chose the signing bonus and the salary multiples over civilian work, and who chose to cross an internationally recognized border to bring fuel to an invading force. He had been told this stretch of road was safe, and on that single point his command was wrong. The Ukrainian operator who pressed the trigger does not, as far as can be confirmed, know any of this. He knows the silhouette he hit. He knows the column of smoke he produced. He knows the after-action assessment that landed on his commander's desk later that evening with a single word stamped in green at the top. Confirmed. That is the war. 70 kilometers of road that used to be safe, that is not safe anymore. Between a depot, a logistics colonel was told to defend, and a refueling point an armor battalion was told to depend on. With a Ukrainian FPV, no bigger than a microwave oven crossing the distance in 52 minutes, carrying a warhead that costs less than the fuel it destroyed. The lieutenant colonel will revise his maps. The battalion will reschedule its counterattack. The Ukrainian operator will sleep, wake, and fly again. The driver will not. There is no safe kilometer anymore. Not between the front line and the depot. Not between the depot and the supply yard. Not between the supply yard and Moscow's outer ring road, where Ukrainian deep strike drones have, on 3 separate occasions in 2026, already reached and burned things the Russian state insisted could not be reached. The drones are already there. They are watching. They are waiting. They only need 1 clean second.